16 of Works of Sallust. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chester. Works of Gaius Sallustius Crispus. Translated by Alfred W. Pollard. Jugurthine War, Part 7. The next day, before marching out to the attack, he ordered the whole of the cavalry to patrol before the camp, on the side by which the king had made his approach, and assigned the charge of the different gates and the neighboring points to the different tribunes. He then marched up to the town and attacked the wall as on the former day. While he was so engaged, Jugurtha suddenly dashed upon our men from an ambush. Those who had been posted nearest to his point of attack were for the moment frightened and thrown into confusion. The rest, however, quickly came to their aid. The Numidians could now have no longer stood their ground, had not their infantry, mingled with the horsemen, made great havoc in the encounter. In reliance on these, instead of following the usual cavalry tactics of alternate pursuit and retreat, they charged horse against horse, and entangled and confused our ranks, and thus, by the help of their light infantry, almost defeated their enemy. Meantime the conflict was raging around Zama. The struggle was fiercest at the several points where a lieutenant or tribune was in command, and no one trusted to his neighbor's valor instead of his own. The townspeople showed no less vigor. At every point there was assault and preparations to meet it. On each side, men were more eager to wound their opponents than to defend themselves. Shouts of encouragement, joy, and pain arose to heaven amid the din of arms, while darts were flying from side to side. When the enemy for a while slackened in their attack, the defenders of the wall watched with eagerness the distant cavalry engagement. As Jugurtha's fortunes rose and fell, you might mark them now rejoicing and now in fear, as if they could be heard or seen by their comrades. Some shouted warnings, others encouragement, while they beckoned and gesticulated and swayed their bodies, as if to avoid or hurl the darts. Marius, who was in command at this point, marked their behavior, and feigning despair, purposely slackened the attack, and suffered the Numidians to gaze without disturbance at the king's encounter. As soon as they were strongly engrossed in anxiety for their comrades, he suddenly assaulted the wall with the utmost violence, and the soldiers had already climbed their ladders and almost seized the battlements, when the townspeople rallied and met them with a shower of stones, fire, and other missiles. Our men at first stood their ground. Then, as one ladder after another was broken, and those who had stood on them dashed to the ground, the remnant, some whole and sound, but many sorely wounded, made their retreat as best they could. At last night broke off the engagement. Metellus saw that his attempt was vain. The town was not captured. Jugurtha never gave battle except in surprises or in ground of his own choosing, and the summer was already past. He now retreated from Zama, and, after placing garrisons in such of the towns which had succeeded to him as were sufficiently protected by their position or fortifications, led the rest of his army to its station in that part of the province which borders on Numidia. He did not, however, follow the custom of other commanders and surrender that season to repose and luxury, but since the war was little advanced by force of arms, aimed a secret attack against the king by means of his friends, and prepared to use their treachery instead of arms. The man who, as Jugurtha's greatest friend, had the greatest power of deceiving him, was Balmasar, the same who had been with him at Rome, and, after giving sureties in the matter of Massiva's death, had fled to escape trial. To this man Metellus now applied with many promises, and induced him, as a first step, to visit him secretly for the sake of a conference, and then pledged his word that on his surrendering, Jugurtha dead or alive, the Senate would grant him a full pardon and possession of all his goods. These offers easily won over the Numidian, who, besides his natural inclination to treachery, was alarmed lest in the event of peace being concluded with Rome, his own surrender for punishment might be one of the terms of the treaty. On the first favorable occasion, Balmosar approached Jugurtha at a moment when he was troubled and lamenting his fortunes, and advised and conjured him with tears at last to take thought for himself and his children, and the Numidian people, who had deserved so well of him. He reminded him that they had been beaten in every battle, their country wasted, many of his subjects made prisoners or killed, and the resources of his kingdom utterly impaired. The courage of his soldiers and the fervor of fortune had already been tried sufficiently often. He implored him to be on his guard lest, while he was hesitating, the Numidians should take counsel for themselves. By these and other like arguments, Balmosar incited the king to surrender, and ambassadors were dispatched to the general to announce that Jugurtha was ready to comply with his orders, and offered to surrender himself and his kingdom to his protection without any stipulation. Metellus hastily ordered all persons of senatorial rank to be summoned from their winter quarters, and held an assembly of these and such other persons as he himself thought fit. According, therefore, to ancient custom, by the decree of his council, he sent through the ambassadors his commands to Jugurtha to deliver up 200,000 pounds of silver, all his elephants, and a large number of horses and suits of armor. These commands were complied with without delay, and he now ordered that all his deserters should be brought to him in chains. The greater number were delivered to him in obedience to these orders. A few, as soon as the surrender began, had escaped to Mauritania, to King Bacchus. After being thus plundered of arms, men, and money, Jugurtha was summoned in person to Tysidium, there to await further orders. On this he began once more to waver in his resolution, and, in consciousness of his guilt, to fear the punishment he deserved, after wasting many days in hesitation, during which at one moment in disgust at his ill fortune he thought anything preferable to war, at another he considered how great would be the fall from king to slave. He at last resumed the war, after vainly sacrificing many of his chief means of defense. At Rome the Senate, when consulted as to the disposition of the provinces, had decreed Numidia to Metellus. About the same time it happened that, as Gaius Marius was invoking the gods in sacrifice, the diviner informed him that there were portents of great and wonderful events, and that he should therefore carry out in reliance on the gods whatever projects he had in his mind. Let him try fortune as often as he would, the issue would always be favorable. Even before this, Marius had been tormented with a great desire for the consulship, for attaining which he was, indeed, well endowed with every qualification except that of ancient family. He was energetic, upright, of wide experience in warfare, and immense courage in battle. In domestic life he was frugal, unconquered by lust and riches, and only covetous of glory. The birthplace of Marius was Arpinum, and there he spent his boyhood. As soon as he was of an age of military service, he practiced himself not in Greek oratory or in elegant accomplishments, but in campaigning, and thus amid honorable pursuits his character quickly developed, unimpaired. On his seeking election as a military tribune, few people even knew him by sight, but the fame of his exploits procured his return by every tribe. Beginning with this, he won successive magistracies, and always so conducted himself in office as to be esteemed worthy of a more important post than the one he held. Such was the quality he had shown hitherto, for afterwards his thirst for popularity worked his ruin. And yet he did not dare to stand for the consulship. Even as late as this, the commons had entrance to other magistracies, but the consulship was preserved by the nobility as the hereditary possession of their order. No self-made man was so distinguished or had performed such noble deeds as to be held worthy of that office, or other than unclean. When Marius saw that the words of the diviner pointed in the same direction as his own desires were spurring him, he asked leave of absence from Metellus, in order to stand as a candidate. Metellus was eminently endowed with courage, renown, and much else that good men might desire. He had, however, that evil so common with men of rank, a scornful and haughty temper. At first, astonished by so unusual an occurrence, he expressed his surprise at Marius' project, and advised him with an appearance of friendship not to enter upon so improper a course, nor to cherish thoughts above his fortunes. It was not everything, he said, that all men were free to desire. Marius ought to be content with his position, and, in fine, should be careful not to demand from the Roman people a favor which they would rightly deny him. Finding that these and other arguments did not change Marius's resolution, Metellus answered him with a promise to do what he asked, as soon as the public business would allow. When, however, the request was subsequently repeated with some frequency, he is said to have remarked that Marius should be in no hurry to depart, as it would be time enough for him to stand for the consulship in the same year as his own son, a youth of about 20, who was serving at the time in the war and sharing his father's tent. This remark, as was afterwards seen, strongly excited Marius to efforts to gain the office to which he aspired, and to enmity towards Metellus. He set to work under the influence of ambition and anger, those worst of counselors, and refrained from no act or speech that might gain him popularity. He treated the soldiers whom he commanded in the winter quarters with more indulgence than before, and at the same time spread slanderous and boastful insinuations about the war among the traitors, of whom there were many at Attica, were but the half of the army, he said, entrusted to him. In a few days he would have Jugurtha in chains. The general was purposely procrastinating war in the excessive delight which a frivolous man of regal haughtiness took in authority. These insinuations seemed to the traitors all the better grounded, inasmuch as the length of the war had impaired their fortunes, and to the eager mind no haste is sufficient. There was, moreover, in our army a Numidian named Gorda, a son of Masdanabal and grandson of Massinissa, whom Micipsa, when spent with disease, and with his mental powers thus somewhat impaired, had appointed in his will as his second heir. Gorda had requested Metellus to assign him, as a prince, a seat next to his own, and again, on a subsequent occasion, to grant him a squadron of Roman cavalry as a bodyguard. Both of these requests Metellus refused, the seat of honor because by custom it belonged only to those whom the Roman people recognized as kings. The guard, inasmuch as it would be an insult to Roman cavalry to consign them as attendants to a Numidian. Marius made advances to Gorda in his trouble, and encouraged him to try, with his help, to avenge himself on the general for these insults, inflating with fair speeches a mind which diseases had enfeebled. He represented to Garda that he was a king, an important person, and the grandson of Massinissa. Should Jugurtha be captured or slain, he would have immediate possession of the kingdom of Numidia, and this might quickly be brought to pass if he himself were dispatched as consul to direct the war. In this way, not only Garda, but the Roman knights, the soldiers and traders, were incited, some by Marius personally, many by the hope of peace, to speak bitterly of Metellus' conduct of the war in their letters to their connections at Rome, and to ask for Marius as general. It thus came to pass that many persons sought to gain the consulship for him, with the most honorable recommendations, while just at this period the commons, after routing the nobility by the Mamilian law, were supporting men of no birth as candidates. Thus everything combined to favor Marius. In the meantime, Jugurtha, after breaking off his surrender and renewing the war, was zealously making all possible preparations, showing great activity, and collecting an army. He tried by threats and by holding out rewards to gain over the cities which had deserted him, fortified his own positions, replaced by manufacture or purchase the armor, weapons, and other material which he had sacrificed in the hope of peace, attracted bodies of Roman slaves, and with his money tampered even with the Roman garrisons. In a word, he left nothing untried, no stone unturned, but adopted every possible expedient. When Jugurtha had first opened negotiations for peace, at the importunate entreaty of the king, to whom at heart the inhabitants had never been disloyal, the chief citizens now formed a conspiracy. As for the common people, they, as usual, especially with Numidians, were of an inconstant temper, rebellious, and full of discord, eager for change, the enemies of peace and quietness. Arranging their plans among themselves, they agreed to carry them out on the third day, which was one observed as a festival throughout all Africa, and promised rather sport and wantonness than alarm. When the time arrived, the centurions, military tribunes, and the governor of the town, Titus Turpilius Silanus himself, were invited by different citizens to their homes, and all, with the exception of Turpilius, massacred in the course of the banquet. The conspirators then attacked the soldiers, who were wandering about unarmed, as was natural on such a day, and in the absence of their officers. The common people followed their example, some instructed by the nobles, others urged only by the zeal for such work. These were ignorant of what had been done and the purpose of it, but found in the mere rioting and revolution enough to content them. The Roman soldiers, baffled by so unexpected an alarm, and not knowing what best to do, fell into confusion. A force of the enemy barred their path to the citadel, where their standards and shields were deposited. The gates, previously closed, prevented their flight, and the women and children standing on the edge of the roofs zealously hurled at them stones and such other missiles as were at hand. Against so baffling a danger no precautions could be taken, and the bravest soldiers could make no resistance to these weakest of opponents. Good and bad, stout and cowardly, were alike massacred unavenged. Amid these outrages, when the cruelty of the Numidians was at its height, and every gate shut, the governor Turpilius was the single Italian who escaped unharmed. Whether this was the result of his host's compassion, of a bargain, or of chance, I cannot assure myself. Inasmuch, however, as in such a calamity he preferred a shameful life to unspotted honor, he seems to have been a worthless and execrable character. Metellus, on receiving news of the event at Vaga, for a short while retired in sorrow from the public gaze. As soon as anger began to mingle with his grief, he hastened with the utmost zeal to avenge the wrong. Exactly at sunset, he led out the legions with which he was in winter quarters, and as many Numidian horsemen as he could muster, lightly equipped. About the third hour of the next day he arrived at a plain surrounded on all sides by somewhat higher ground. His soldiers, tired with their long march, were inclined to be mutinous, when Metellus laid the matter before them, told them that Vaga was not more than a mile distant, and that they ought cheerfully to submit to the rest of their toil, so long as they could avenge their fellow citizens, those bravest and most unfortunate of men. In addition, he generously promised them the booty. After thus raising their spirits, he ordered the cavalry to go in front in skirmishing order, and the infantry to follow with their ranks as close as possible, and their engines concealed. The people of Vaga, on perceiving that an army was marching in their direction, at first conjectured rightly that it was Metellus, and closed their gates. When, however, they noticed that their lands were not being wasted, and that the van was composed of Numidian cavalry, they changed their minds, and thinking it was Jugurtha who was coming, went forth to meet him with great rejoicing. Suddenly, part of the cavalry and infantry at a given signal cut to pieces the crowd which had poured out of the town, while others hurried to the gates, and others seized the towers. Rage and the hope of plunder overcame their weariness. The men of Vaga rejoiced in their treachery for only 2 days. The whole of that great and wealthy city was now given over to vengeance and plunder. Turpilius, the governor of the town, who, as explained above, was the only man who escaped the massacre, was ordered by Metellus to stand his trial. He excused his conduct but lamely, was condemned, and, as a Latin citizen, punished by scourging and decapitation. End of Jugurthine War, Part 7.